I'm so excited to welcome you to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. My name is Emily Holland, and I'm thrilled to have Sarah Ghazal Ali here to discuss her collection Theophanies with us this evening. Sarah, welcome. So excited to have you.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me, Emily and Zach, Poet Lord, the Writer's Center. I love these craft chats so much, and I didn't realize there were over 100. That's incredible. You guys are doing the good work and really do make amazing podcasts. I just kind of put them on when I'm doing the dishes, and it's the best. So
See,
I'm so
you heard it here first.
yeah.
Great.
Um,
So could you kick us off with a few poems to start?
sure, I'd be happy to. Okay. Here's the book. Here's Theophanies. Self-portrait as Epiphany. I thought myself a child. The river revealed me a basket. Within a doomed girl grew and groomed. When came the bush, I knew to burn, to shear errant tongues probing the cage. Mother sang of deliverance. Father prayed for a son. I revised myself a daughter, renounced duty, rolled stones down my throat. In a dream, the angel reveals me a book. I learn myself grime among false gods. Unashamed, I cramp. Between my legs, a clot. From a clot, I'll make men. Hollow myself holy. Nothing laughs like me. Brittle, brutish, a woman bearing her teeth. And then there's two title poems in the book, so I'll read the first one, Theophanies. A pair of apples blistering under the sun, my eyes have been so saturated. Before dream deep, I start awake, overstimulated by the stacking of my bones, their caress and jostle. My granted days, I could live or leave. Each loaned breath I can, do, waste, or wield, straining for the bell in belief. How an arrow flees limb to pierce, how a pen bleeds to grant shape to speech. In each instance of angels' descent, they soothe, do not fear, O Hajar, Maryam, vesseled thee. Or is it awe that clamors the flesh? A raptor's lean shadow for a flash, obliterating the high noon sun. May it be done to me so clearly, like sirens, like chimes. And I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you. I love that you chose those poems because there's so much sound happening, so much texture, and I have a couple questions around those as well. So we'll just dive right into it. Before we get to the questions that I sent over, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Who are you? And maybe how did you come to poetry?
Yeah, sure. So I feel like I have to start with my name. So I'm Sarah, and my full name is Sarah Ghazal Ali. And I didn't pick my middle name. It's very much my legal middle name. And I think that it's a really funny case of nominative determinism,
Mm.
where my middle name is a poetic form, and it just feels like it was predestined that I'd be interested in poetry. And I think initially my immersion in lyric and in poetry was the ghazal, specifically Urdu ghazals. My dad is a really wonderful singer. He has a great voice that I did not inherit. And I grew up listening to Urdu ghazals in the car, long before I actually knew what they were. I feel like I made the connection that, oh, I'm named for this type of poem much later in life. So I think I took it for granted. And yeah, I think I really came to poetry in college. I enjoyed it in school, like the standard canon that you're assigned. But I didn't like all the close reading we had to do and all of the like declarations you have to make about what something symbolizes in a poem. But in college, I think when I was assigned contemporary poets in an intro to creative writing class, that really just blew my mind because I didn't know there were contemporary poets. I thought everyone was dead. And so that was really exciting. And then that made it feel more possible, not just something that you read, but something that you can also try to write. So yeah, I kind of started in college more formally trying to write things that I would then call poems. And I don't think I really started calling myself a poet until even more recently. Now that feels like something that I can say with a lot more confidence, not because I've gained anything or have a degree or whatever, but just because I feel more comfortable in what poetry does in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think it's interesting how many of us have a similar path, right? Where it just takes sort of tapping into the contemporary poetry landscape to realize, oh, this isn't something that is so far removed from my own existence or my own abilities. Um, it's a shame that it takes some of us so long to get there too. Um, Hopefully that's changing now, little by little. All right. So our first question is sometimes considered our most difficult, but it's kind of fun. And I think for poets, at least, we're always sort of noticing these small moves, these little nuances, but we're not always asked about them. We don't always get to talk about these things that we do on the page. So what's something that you haven't been asked about your work that you have been wanting to talk about, or something you notice that you do with your poems that hasn't been brought up yet?
I really love this question and I'm really grateful for it. I think for me, it's line breaks. I love working with the line, and it's something in the book that I feel really proud of. And most like that was my craft accomplishment. And I have been wanting to talk about the line as a unit of meaning, but it doesn't come up too much. Yeah, I think I love the line as a unit of meaning because I think it's a really good way to bring play into poetry, especially if what you're writing about tends to be really heavy, which I know is true for many people and is definitely true for me. And yeah, that really helps me kind of distance myself from the thing that is painful, and it turns into something more excitingly creative instead of just devastating. So I really like playing with the line to play. And I also think it was really important to me in a number of poems to be able to say as many things possible. I very much I don't like the idea of reading a poem and then being asked like, oh, what does it mean? I want there to be lots of built-in ambivalence, and I want to be able to ask a million questions and say a million things and also say contradictory things in the same space on the same page without it feeling chaotic or without it feeling scattered. And the line as a unit of meaning is such a great way to do that, where like the line pulls you horizontally and can say one thing, and then the question is, where do you want your reader to take a breath? Where do you want your reader's eye to go and stop and track? And so then it's also this really exciting way to kind of use your finger to like turn the reader's cheek a little bit to I guess direct their attention. So it's a really interesting way to think about who will be reading this and engaging with this, and how can you play with speed and with time and with what you're drawing their attention to. Like I love how the line isolates a thought, because the poem is where I go to do my thinking. And so then how can I make it a more interactive experience when a reader encounters my thoughts unfurling on the page? You know what I
Mm.
mean? So I
Yeah.
love the line as a place for ambivalence and to say many things and not be locked into one thing.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's sort of reaching towards possibility rather than reaching towards restriction. And I think I noticed as I was reading and sort of rereading the poems, those moments of pausing, absorbing meaning, but then that kind of cascade into a new meaning and that sort of revelation that also feels very connected to some of the overall themes and like concerns of the book as well, right? These kind of, the ways that even the lines sort of lean into this idea of the divine or the spiritual, right? As we're moving through and kind of creating meaning in different moments as well. I love that. I feel like we could talk about the line for this whole hour, which is silly.
Absolutely.
And we very well might, who knows? We might always come back to the line. Um, but I mean, you started talking about your name and the form. And there's a couple of different directions that we can go with thinking about the form of the ghazal, especially. There's a few ghazals in here, even a failed ghazal. And then there's other forms, though, pantoums, litanies, elegies, a lot of formal play happening here. So I wondered if you could talk about your relationship to form overall, and at what point in your writing process does form come into the poem?
Hmm. I am very much obsessed with form. I love working in received forms and then also thinking about what else is possible. Where do you break a form? Where do you invent or build upon what we have received? Um, I think for me, I think about how our physical bodies are the first site of experience for us. You know, like we have our senses, we touch, we feel, we see, we smell, and everything that we experience is mediated through our bodies. And I feel like I can't look at poetry differently. I feel like the form of a poem is very much the body of the poem. And so if it's then a site of experience, what does that experience enacted look like? I feel like I can't separate that question from like what are the words of the poem? Yeah, I feel like it's inextricable for me, form and content. So usually when I sit down to write, I think part of it's intuition where like for me, naturally I tend to gravitate towards couplets or tercets. There was a long period of time when I would only write things, in tercets. It just
Mm.
felt intuitively good. Um, but form definitely never comes later for me. It always either I start with the form and then I'm like trying to fill the room of the
Mm.
form, with the furniture, which is the language. Or I just begin writing and it just kind of intuitively takes the shape that it
Mm.
takes. Like an example would be the pantoum in the book, Mother of Nations. That very much, like I sat down and I knew that I wanted to write a pantoum, and I knew that the poem that would emerge could only be a pantoum.
Mm.
And the poem that's in the book, it's about Sarah, who is called in the Bible the Mother of Nations, um, and her inability to conceive a child. And so built into that is the repetition of a menstrual cycle, like that is the sign that you are not pregnant. So if there's some sort of physiological cycle that's happening outside of the poem that's informing the poem, how can I enact that through the poem? And so a pantoum is the only thing that makes sense because with every few steps forward you take into the next stanza, you're also having to return to the previous and pull it down.
Mm.
And so, yeah, it felt like those two things, the content and the form, were married and they couldn't exist outside of each other or independent of each other. It very much like as soon as I knew I had the form, I was like, oh, okay, menstruation is going to be part of this. Sarah's going to be part of this, not having children, et cetera, et cetera. And then it just sort of happened. Pantoums are so hard to write, but it was, yeah, I think I've only written 2 ever because they're just so hard, but it felt very concentrated and very like necessary as soon as I had the form in mind. Yeah, I think generally they emerged together for me.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting too, right? We're always talking about the relationship between form and content and how they inform each other, and how, the great formal poems really show that kind of synthesis. And I think the Pantoum in Theophanies is one of them, right? Where you're reading and you're sort of like, oh, the cycle, right? And the poem is making us experience the cycle at the same time. And every sort of repetition or even twist of repetition is sort of reminding us of the poem's main kind of energy, right? And yeah, I was going to say Pantoums are so difficult. So I was really excited to see one here, because they always drive me up the wall when I'm trying to do that piecing together. But even the ghazal is sort of a repetitive form in that kind of end word of those couplets too. And I think, those repetitions have a lot of interplay with the sounds of the poems as well. And in the poems that you read, to start the chat, I think we could all hear a lot of those sounds coming through. So I wanted to ask you about your approach to sound and even leaning into maybe forms that approach sound too. You mentioned the ghazal, the kind of musical element of that, and that obviously is cluing us into some sound work. But even some of the concerns of the book, right? Prayer, this sort of voices and these echoes that come through. I think we're all sort of lending themselves to the way that sound was really impactful in the lines and the uses there. So I wanted to just know your approach to incorporating sounds within poems, within images, within lines, right? We go back to the humble line. How do you sort of use that to play with other elements of the poems, like image and metaphor and things like that?
I think sound is so important, especially because my origin story is so tied to music, to the ghazal as an auditory experience first. And also my relationship to the Qur'an in Arabic has been really instrumental too. I think it kind of feels like I want my poems to be something that I could memorize, and music really helps with that. Like it's so easy to memorize a song, and songs have choruses and there's repetitions, and there's something to that, to the ability to hold a poem in your body or in your mind in a certain way. And I think that's really tied to the way I grew up listening to the Quran and then learning to read the Quran specifically in Arabic, because it's very rhythmic, it's very musical, there's built-in repetition, and the Quran is also a text that people across the globe memorize. And like that's my relationship too, is there's so many different chapters in it that I have memorized. And yeah, I think for me, reading my poems aloud after I finish a draft is really useful. I can't really do it while I'm writing because for some reason, as strange as it sounds, speaking out loud really takes me out. But I know for a lot of people, reading aloud is really important to the process. But for me, it has to come at the end. So I have to listen to some sort of instrumental music, the same song on repeat while I'm writing. So I'm like in this particular zone and in like a different kind of auditory immersion. And then once I have a draft, then I read it aloud over and over again and try to kind of tweak where I think either my mouth is unable to kind of form the line or the sentence or the stanza. Yeah, I think if I can't read it well aloud, then something's wrong, even if it looks good on the page. But yeah, sound feels like something that is a really important part of my revision process, but not an obvious thing that I'm thinking
Mm.
about while drafting. While drafting, it's very much just like following the impulse and seeing what happens. And then sound is something that you refine or that I refine afterwards.
Yeah, I always say that like my number one revision tip is like read your poem aloud before you start messing with it, right? Because even those moments where you're sort of stumbling, that you might not change very much, but they're just a clue that something's not quite maybe fitting as well as it could. And I think that sometimes we forget when we're so focused on the page that poetry is an oral tradition and it should be spoken out loud and sort of play into that way that it can be off the page as well as on the page too. And I
Absolutely.
love that you mentioned listening to one song on repeat because I can only listen to one song on repeat when I'm writing. If the songs are changing, I'm not getting anything done.
Same. I get distracted. And even just the way a song ends and then a new one
Mhm.
starts, it's just, it takes you out and you have to fully be in it.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, though, I know some people really love reading their poems out loud, but I don't. I'm a
Mm.
poet. I'm like, here, you can have the book and you can read it for me. But yeah, for like someone who likes musical poems, I feel like there's no music in my reading for in my
Mm.
head, you know?
I don't think that's necessarily true, but I wanted to pick up on something you mentioned too, this sort of active memorization, and it made me think a lot about what you were talking about earlier with the poem and the body and how we encounter the world through our bodies and then the form being like the body of the poem. And memorization to me has always felt like a way to sort of absorb a poem within the body and kind of an extension of that. So I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that memorization impulse in any way you see that kind of fitting in with your approach to poetry or the page in some way.
Ooh, that's so interesting. Yeah, memorization just feels like actually absorbing something, but then even memorization, there's degrees to it, which I've realized. So for example, if in Islam, when you perform your ritual prayers like 5 times a day, you're reciting them in Arabic. And Arabic isn't a language that I speak or read. I can read the script, I can sound out the words, but I don't know what I'm saying. And so when I'm praying too, it's memorized Arabic. It's not
Mm.
Arabic that I am fully comprehending. I have to like pull up a translation and learn it side by side. Um, and this funny thing happens where like if you get distracted while you're praying, you can lose your place in the prayer.
Mm.
And that reveals to me the limits of my memorization too, because you're kind of doing this thing on autopilot when you've memorized. And if you lose your place, it's really hard to pick it back up in the middle because it's not a language that I speak. So I feel like I have to go all the way back to the beginning and start it from the top. And that is just so, I don't know if I have anything smart to say about it, but it's so curious to me
Mm.
that even the way you memorize, it's like you memorized it in a certain chronological order and you can't split up the individual pieces or you can't parse out the syntax, you know?
Mm.
Um, and I wonder about that with poems too, where I don't have any of my poems fully committed to memory, but there are moments that like there's a couple of lines here and there that are just like highlighted in my brain. And for
Mm.
that, I can look up and just recite those from memory. And I'm thinking now about like what is it about certain moments that can stand on their own, separate from the larger unit of the poem or the book. And yeah, I'm like thinking about poetry and prayer and
Mm.
the limits of memorization as well, or the way that you do it. And so it's like, how much did you actually absorb to the point of digestion, and how much are you just holding, but not really like letting seep into your bones in a certain way?
Mm.
Yeah, so I'm answering your question with a question.
No, I think, that's our job, right? We're here to probe with more questions, and maybe there's some sort of craft meditation on that as well. No, I think that's really interesting. And really true, right? I see some folks chiming in the chat, right? That sense of interruption that can sort of halt the whole forward momentum. Um,
Option,
yeah,
yeah.
so interesting. I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. As I'm thinking about that, folks, please put your questions in the chat. We'd love to loop them in. I mean, I have plenty to keep us going, but please add some questions there. So since we're talking about language, I really was interested in moments where it seemed like for one reason or another, the language was failing, either the speakers or even like the form of the poem. We mentioned the kind of failed ghazal, and then the matrilineage kind of recovered piece as well. Um, and there's a couple of different languages here, right? English, Arabic, Urdu, but then languages of prayer, lineage, right? There's a lot of sort of swirling around of different language. So maybe this is a big question to ask, but how do you kind of navigate the possibility of failure as a poet?
I think this is such a great question and such a big question that we could also talk about for hours because I think it's on everyone's mind all the time. I think for me, failure is a really generative space, or at the very least, I try to frame it for myself as a generative space. I'm trying to connect failure to the limitations of language and the limitations of knowledge.
Mm.
And it's like a wall that you come up against, and you can either like pound on the wall and try to break it and fail and exhaust yourself, or you can kind of just like be in wonder when you're faced with the wall, and then your thoughts can kind of be the thing that go over it and around it and trace its contours. I think that encounter is really useful for me, where oh my gosh, everything for me comes back to the Quran in one way or another. But there are these, I talked about this at AWP on a panel, but there are these letters, like letters of the alphabet that begin certain chapters of the Quran, just as is. So for example, like WYN, like a chapter will just begin with those three letters and then continue and say what it needs to say. And those letters are like the mysterious letters where no one knows why they begin certain chapters and why they don't begin others. It just seems random and just placed there. And I look at those, and I've heard scholars talk about them as like a manifestation of the limitations of knowledge, where even though God is sharing, you know, like scripture to guide you in your life, to kind of give you a handbook by which to live out your days, there are still some things that you just can't know because you are a small human and you are mortal and you're not a god, you know? And I think that those could be moments of frustration, or it could be a moment of like absolute bewilderment where you're just encountering them and that's it. That's as far as you can get is the encounter. And I think that's where poetry comes in for me, where poetry is the place to take the encounter and trace it, and then not reveal anything or not say anything that gets you closer to knowledge, but that becomes more about imagination and questioning and touching and tracing and feeling, just kind of feeling your way through the dark. And I think it's that feeling and tracing that is so exciting and wondrous. And that's what I think failure as a wall can offer. I feel like it's just about reframing it as a place of possibility to do your thinking, because all we can do is our thinking. And I do think that there are, you know, limits to how far what you know or what a fact is can go.
I love that. Wow, that's such a great answer to almost an impossible question, right? These things that we're all thinking about when we approach the blank page, right? and kind of stare in the face of everything that we don't know or can't know or are kind of circling around, grasping to know.
Mhm.
Um,
Grasping.
yeah, I love that. It looks like we have a lot of great questions in the chat, but I think D.W. Baker had kind of along the similar thought frame, so I'll pop that one in now. Asking, do you ever think about or can you speak to limits of repetition in some way? Yeah, it's a good question.
Repetition is something that I think a lot about. I think that becomes like a craft challenge too, where if something is repeated enough, it can become monotonous or even kind of grating to the ear. And I think the question is then, how do you use repetition in a way that kind of activates your senses instead of dulling them?
Mm.
Um, and that I feel like is just a case by case thing where, it could be repetition as in a repeated image or concern or question that's popping up across multiple poems. So that's like a conceptual sort of repetition. And then it's about how do you space these recurrences apart? How do you make sure they're not too far apart that the reader doesn't lose that train of thought, where it becomes about spacing. And then there's repetition, within a single poem, maybe like a recursive thought. And with that, for me, it's about if you're repeating something over and over again, it almost becomes like a hum or like a drone in your ear. And then, like, what's unlocked against that backdrop? Like, if something is blurring together because you're saying it over and over again, what is the thing that's then isolated and brought to the forefront against that? Where repetition can be kind of like a chorus, and then it's like, what's the singular voice that speaks against it or is brought into relief against it? So again, I'm answering a question with more questions, but yeah, it becomes like a craft challenge, and then the challenge is how do you make this not get grating to your ear or overwhelming or even just dull, and how do you keep it exciting?
Yeah, yeah, that's a question I find myself asking too, as someone who loves leaning into repetition and loves thinking about, what does it mean to repeat and shift meaning? What does it mean to repeat and reinforce meaning, right? There's so many questions that we probably won't answer, but that's why we keep writing. Um, I
Oh,
think
can I share a poem that I think
yes.
is just like the best repetition example for me is You Are Who I Love by, is it Araceli Skirmay?
I
I
think so.
think,
I feel like I just saw that poem circling, Valentine's Day.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's just such a radical poem and also so tender, but the
yeah,
repetition becomes this like really, okay, yeah, Araceli's. I think the repetition there is just, it's really beautiful to just let wash over you.
I think I'll pop a link in the chat here. There we go. Multitasking at its finest. Okay. Thank you for sharing that too. I always love when we can bring in other poets, right? We're never working in isolation. We're always
Mhm.
in conversation with everyone else. I think Nona had a question about form. Do you have any forms that you have not tried yet but plan to, or maybe thinking about failure? Are there forms that you've tried and maybe failed to complete yet?
Mhm. Okay, a form that I'm very intimidated by is the sestina.
Mm,
It's so hard. That's like next level hard for me. And I want to try so badly, but every time I sit down to do it, it just feels so mechanical and I'm overwhelmed and I give up. But that is the next big thing that I want to try. Yeah, sestinas terrify me. And for that second question about forms that I feel like I fail at, I think all of my ghazals are failures.
mm,
I like cannot bring myself to read them out loud. I think that they fail aloud. But they're the things that people are most excited to talk to me about. And inside I'm just like dying because I don't like them. But yeah, I think because I started out with like Urdu ghazals and
mm,
hearing them in like in the mouths of the great Urdu classical singers, my standards are impossibly high, and I don't live up to my own standards at all. And yeah, I'm sitting with that. Ghazals are really hard, they're really beautiful, and I think, in all honesty, I think every English ghazal is a failure. But failures are, as we talked about, beautiful, great things. So I don't think anyone should not write them. But I'm parsing out my relationship to them.
No, I love that answer. I mean, love the guzzles in this book, but I think, it's maybe a key element that you did include that failed guzzle, right? And the ways that the English language fails to capture so much of the beauty of that form. I think we see that with a lot of forms that come from other traditions when they're sort of taken into the English tradition. It's not the same, which is fine, right? It can fail and still be beautiful. I think that, yeah, that's a wonderful thought. So many things that I'm just going to keep thinking about after this chat. And some really great questions in the chat as well. Deb had a question about organizing the poems, and I had some questions about organizing as well, because I think that sometimes it's so difficult, right? When you've been writing these poems and then you're putting together a manuscript and you're like, okay, now what? Now what do I do? So could you talk about your approach to organizing maybe on a general scale? I love that sort of opening poem that's kind of separate from the rest of the sections that we get. Then we get those kind of three sections. And then, of course, we can talk about the title poems and those choices too. But maybe just kind of overarching organization, and then we can get down into the more small choices.
I think there's so much there. So the proem, like that first prefatory poem in the book, My Faith Gets Grime Under Its Nails, that poem, it felt very necessary to isolate that. Once it was written, I knew that it was important that it kind of stand alone in a way. And for me, that poem sets the terms of engagement for the book because, once you've written it and it's living out in the world as an object, I can't really control how it's being read or how it's being received or anything really. And so that was my small attempt to try to set the terms of engagement, where the poem is in 4 parts and each section begins with a line from one of the last 4 chapters of the Qur'an, which are they're called like the Jargul, which are the 4 chapters that begin with the word gul, which is the command or imperative say or recite. And those are 4 chapters that, like as children, you read them before you leave the house, like as protection, you read them before going to bed. Like it's just kind of, it like lives in your bones in a certain way. And so I wanted that architecture to be right at the beginning to kind of frame the book as like a project in beseeching and to kind of make prayer feel inseparable from the poems and what they're trying to do in the world. Yeah, that felt really important in kind of ordering, where I was like, that needs to go at the beginning to kind of like almost like a thesis statement of whatever you take out of this, please know that I'm beginning with a prayer. And beyond that, I think I love talking about structure and order because for me, that's where I got really mathematical, where I printed out all the poems when I felt like I was done generating, done writing, and they had to go up on the wall. I like taped them all up in whatever order felt kind of natural. I lived with them that way for a bit and then took them all down. And then I went through with sticky notes and reread the whole quote unquote book in its early form. And I wrote down anything that repeated or reappeared in the book, any motifs or any words, like eyes were all over the place. And sorry if you can hear the ambulance. Okay. My computer's asking me if I'm playing music. Oh, no.
We're all good on our end. So.
Okay, okay, beautiful. Sorry, it was so loud. Okay, yeah, so I went through and I color coded all of those images and moments that repeated. And so it's like, oh, like love is green and sex is blue and God is yellow and whatever. And then I went through and added those little color coded stickies to the appropriate poems that
Mm.
had that content. And then it became like a visual sort of game. It felt like Tetris kind of, where it's like, oh, like six poems in a row have green, blue, and clear sticky notes on them. That's probably overwhelming. That's like too
Mm.
much God in one area. How can I kind of like space it out? Going back to what I was talking about with repetition,
Mm.
how do you not overwhelm the reader? How do you give them a place to breathe? Where can they pause? Where can they, like, where do I want to pull them in closer and like really keep them focused on this one train of thought? Um, so yeah, color coding was really like practically useful for me.
Mm.
And like thinking about then not you as the writer, but the potential reader who is not you that will be encountering the book. How do you want that encounter to go? Yeah, that was really useful.
Yeah, I love that. I love that visual. I mean, even printing them out and sort of seeing poems in that way, and then taking that extra step with the color coding. I think that's a really great way to do it, especially when you're working with themes that can intersect in so many different ways and so many different poems and repetitions too. Yeah, that's really, I like that kind of structural thing, right? It feels like something that you can grasp versus kind of all the
Yeah.
poems living in like your brain space. You're like, oh, I don't know, there's a
Yeah,
lot
you have to
here.
make it an object to then
Mm,
start thinking about it as an object. Like if it was just on my laptop, I feel like I could have just tinkered forever and not actually
mm,
gotten anywhere. I like needed to print them and turn them into a thing and then engage with the thing.
yeah, I love that. Giving it a corporal form outside of our
Yeah,
screens.
yeah.
So to kind of dive a little bit deeper into structure, I wanted to talk about the title poems. You read one, and I had some thoughts or questions about the other one. But could you just talk generally about that impulse to have two title poems, what their sort of relationship is to each other, and then to the work overall? I think a lot of times. We can put pressure on the title poem or title poems, right? It's like, oh, they have to do so much for the collection. So I'm just curious about your approach to them.
So I used this word, Theophanies, as an umbrella stand-in title for almost every poem of the book, where I felt like I could just keep using this title forever and just keep writing into it. I found it so generative. Um, a theophany is in like a physical manifestation of God, or like I like to think of them as the miracles that we know
Mm.
of. Like, how has God made himself accessible or apparent to man, to mankind? And I think once I can't remember exactly where I came across the word, but once I did, I have that moment of encounter in my notebook
Mm.
where I wrote Theophanies in all caps and like circled it a bunch. And I think it was somewhere like in the middle of grad school. And that kind of, as soon as I saw the word, it just clicked into place that that was my title for whatever it was that I was working on, because it perfectly captured what it was that I was trying to do. I feel like this book is so, it's just a speaker really wanting to brush up against God and trying to mediate that experience through the women of sacred history who have brushed up against God. Like that's the closest I can get to it,
Mm.
to what that experience might be like. And yeah, I knew it was the title because I think I could retitle every poem in the book Theophanies, and I think it would maybe hold up, at least for
Mm.
me personally. Um, so it feels really alive in that way. And originally there was only one title poem, which is the Theophanies that I didn't read, that comes towards the end of the book.
Mm.
Um, that poem, like it emerged fully formed, which I think has only happened to me for maybe two or three poems ever, where like I wrote it in one concentrated, extended moment at my desk, and I don't think I changed. I think if anything, I changed like maybe a couple words here or there, but overall it stayed exactly as it originally came out.
Mm.
Um, and the poem at the beginning of the book, titled Theophanies, that I read, that was one of the last poems that I wrote for the book. And originally I titled it Revelation.
Mm.
And somehow that title just never felt right. It was really towards the end of the editing process where I was like, no, like this is not Revelation. That feels wrong somehow.
Mm.
I think it's another Theophanies poem. And yeah, I think at one point maybe there were four or five poems that were titled Theophanies, but a truer title or a more specific title
Mm.
then kind of emerged. And then in the end, there were just two that felt like they had to be titled Theophanies. And I think for me, they're really spaced out. One is like all the way at the beginning, one is all the way at the end. And so it felt like one was kind of presenting like an initial encounter, and then at the end it was like giving you one final encounter before you left almost. Yeah, I think if I could, I would just like write a Theophanies part two and a Theophanies part three. I feel like I'm not done with it.
We're anxiously awaiting the parts 2 and 3. No, I think that's really interesting. And I love, in the sort of talking through the earlier question about, how do you want readers to encounter the book too, right? We keep going back to this word encounter. And I think it's so amazing because the word itself, theophanies, is about these divine encounters, right? And so it's about those relationships, those kind of brushings against the divine, the spiritual prayer, all of which are sort of concentrated in the book too. So it's like all of our language is sort of coming back to that,
Yeah.
which is great.
Repetition.
There we go, repetition. We are doing all of the things. This is great. And so to get a little bit closer into the text, I know MJ had a question about daughter triptych and the relationship to the epigraph, and sort of how and when do you choose to relate a poem to the holy text, and what do you keep in mind when you're doing those moves?
Mm. I think for some poems, like with that poem specifically, I think that that poem is very much about coming up against a cultural tradition and really struggling to make sense of it. And then the epigraph becomes a reminder to me as the poet that the thing that I'm struggling with is not the literal word that I believe is God's, but the way that it's been applied or the way that I think fallible humans have misinterpreted it or used it for harm, which is true for all language across
Mm.
all cultures and all faiths. And so I think a lot of the poems started out with Quranic epigraphs, and then I found that those weren't necessary. I was leaning on them too heavily
Mm.
to either clarify something that the poem was already doing, or I also had to ask myself, like, who is this for? Like, I already know this. Why am I putting this here? Who am I trying to maybe appease in a certain way? Or like, am I trying to exotify the thing that I believe or like prove something? So if there were moments where I felt like it was maybe being used in an unnecessary way, or a harmful way, then I took them out. And I think that might be the only poem that has an epigraph from the Quran. And then there's one poem or three poems that incorporate the Quran into the
Mm.
language of the poem. And there it was useful because that particular chapter deals with the prophet's anguish, and at a time when he felt like he was abandoned and like couldn't see a way through. And God in the text, in the Revelation, repeats himself and says, shortly after, with hardship comes ease,
Mm.
with hardship comes ease. And it's said twice to reinforce that. I think that's so merciful and so beautiful. And so in that poem that, considers abortion, considers the way that babies that were girls were buried alive. There's like so much heavy stuff in that poem, and it felt really important as a reminder to me as the writer that like the word of God is very different from its application, and those are not the same thing. And there's mercy that I don't want to not exist here. I want there to be a moment of mercy and like a moment for the reader to take a breath and be nourished before encountering something that's, a kind of a really heavy, painful and recollection or experience on the page.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And I think too, it's interesting to think about the purpose of epigraphs, right? The thought that goes into not just what you include at the top of the poem, but the sort of reasons for including that, right? How we put things in conversation for different reasons. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's beautiful. I think that leads into, let me check the time, Beth's question a little bit, where she says, I often find my religious tradition sneaking into my poems and try to censor it, thinking that the reader is of a different belief or anti-God. Do you ever craft your work based on the reader or just write as yourself and hope the reader can find meaning? I think that's a large question.
That's a great question. I think that's something that's really difficult to find the balance between. But I believe that the reader has to come later. I think if you think about the reader too much while you're drafting, you can just never say a true thing, or you can never say a full thing because you just keep self-censoring or keep going back and trying to fix before you ever even fully say the thing that you need to say. And I think that the consideration of the reader should come when you're beginning to think about the poem as a public thing that you will seek to publish somewhere or share with the world in some way, or when you're trying to assemble a number of poems into a book that you then want to share with the world. I think that's the only time that the reader, for me, really should come into play. I also think that you have to do a lot of unlearning. Like in grad school, I read because I love finding new words and because I'm curious and I want to, look up this concept in the dictionary or look up this country that it's taking place in or what have you. And I think that in grad school, I learned that other people don't read to learn things. That's not what they want, I guess. And that really shocked me and also really devastated me because I thought the things that were in my poems were very easily Googleable and very easy to familiarize yourself with if you want to. And I was disappointed over and over again in workshops because it became really clear to me that people weren't doing that work, which I think is the best part of reading someone else's work. And that's when I realized that the people who are generous readers and want to spend time with the world of your work, they will do that work, and you should just trust that. And the people who won't, they're probably not your readers anyways, and they probably, like your work isn't really for them, and that's okay because we can't write for everyone. So learning that, I think, helped me take that reader, like surveilled sort of presence out of the picture when I'm drafting.
Yeah, I think that's so important, right? To one, want to trust your reader to do that work, but also in the back of your mind know that not everyone is going to do that work, and not to let that impact the work that you put on the page too, right?
Yeah.
And I think we have like 1 more minute, so maybe we'll squeeze in one more question, which I think is connected a little bit to this. Because you had a great interview with Bomb Magazine, we'll plug that. But you talked a little bit about this, right? Kind of resisting the ways that your poems have been read in the past and sort of trying to conform them to um, sort of expected conversations and how you kind of refuse to do that on the page. And at AWP this past weekend, on a panel, the poet Kay Ivor brought up this notion of resistance and refusal, and sort of put it in position alongside the opposite of that, which is embracing, right? And thinking through what our work then can embrace. So I think my ending question is, what do you seek to embrace when you're writing, and maybe what do you hope readers will embrace within your work?
That's beautiful. I really love Kay's work. I hope that readers will embrace ambivalence and multiplicity of meaning. I think I write to ask questions and to inquire, not declare. And so I hope that readers will come to the page with curiosity and with an openness to learning something new or learning a different version of a story that they might already be familiar with, and being able to, it's important to me that the reader is able to hold two things side by side and say, well, maybe both of these are true. And what does true even mean? Truth can have many valences to it. And the truest thing is that we don't know anything. And so what do we do with the pieces that we have of like lowercase k knowledge? So yeah, I think ambivalence, being able to sit with, I don't know.
That's beautiful. I think that's a beautiful place to end. Sadly, our time has come to an end. Sarah, thank you so much for your generosity. Thank you for this book. Everyone, please pick up Theophanies where you can find it. Get on that kind of order list for when it's restocked. This has been an amazing chat, and thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom and questions with us.
Thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming. This was so wonderful.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for wonderful questions in the chat as well. Hope to see you back next week. Another craft chat, same time, same place. Sarah, thank you again. I know you've had a busy couple of weeks and days celebrating the collection. So thank you for taking some time tonight.
Of course. Okay. Have a good night.